The clink of ice in a whiskey glass was a punctuation mark in the low hum of the restaurant. Aaliyah moved through the soundscape like a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making no noise on the polished marble. She registered everything: the strained smile on the woman at table 7, the almost imperceptible tremor in the hand of the man at table 9 as he signed his check, the way the air itself seemed to grow heavy and still when certain people walked through the door. Tonight, the air was practically solid. She felt him before she saw him. A shift in the room's gravity, a sudden dip in the ambient temperature. He moved like the room owed him space, and the space conceded. When her eyes finally found him, she understood why. He was with 2 other men, all of them in suits that cost more than her car, but he was the center. The others were planets orbiting a silent, dark star. His suit was a deep charcoal, tailored with surgical precision. It fit a frame that was lean but broad, a study in contained power. As he sat, she caught the glint of a Patek Philippe at his wrist and the faint, clean scent of bergamot and smoke. Her gaze snagged on a detail she wasn't supposed to notice: a thin, white scar that cut vertically through his left eyebrow, a tiny flaw in an otherwise perfect, severe face. His eyes, when they swept the room, were not black, but the color of obsidian chips, hard, sharp, and ancient. This was Kwon Ji-han. She didn't know his name then, but she knew his kind. He was the reason her manager's face was perpetually slick with nervous sweat. Aaliyah kept her posture straight, her expression neutral. She was a professional. Her job was to be invisible, efficient, and forgettable. She took their drink orders, her voice a low, steady murmur. Ji-han didn't look at her, his attention on a tablet one of his men had placed on the table. He ordered a whiskey, neat, with a single word that was less a request and more a quiet command. For the next hour, she served them, refilling water glasses, delivering plates of seared scallops and Wagyu steak that they barely touched. Their conversation was a low rumble of Korean, clipped and tense. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the language of power. It was in the steepled fingers of the man to Ji-han's right, the nervous tap of the pen from the man on his left. It was in the absolute stillness of Kwon Ji-han himself. He was the eye of the storm. Then the language shifted to English. The problem was logistics. A shipment. Containers stuck at the port of Long Beach, tangled in a web of union disputes, customs holds, and a rival company's deliberate interference. "They're bleeding us," the man on the right said, his voice tight with frustration. His name was Park. "Every day they sit as another 50,000 lost. We try to grease the palms of the Port Authority, they get greased by the Cheon Syndicate right back. We try to use our usual trucking firm, their entire fleet gets red-flagged for safety inspections." The man on the left, Choi, shook his head. "It's a stranglehold. We can't move them by rail. The Cheon have that locked down. We can't wait it out. The contents are perishable." Kwon Ji-han said nothing. He simply swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze fixed on the condensation. The scar on his brow seemed to deepen. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. His men squirmed under the weight of it. Aaliyah approached the table to clear their appetizer plates, her movements economical and silent. She was a whisper of motion. She was supposed to be furniture. That's when he did it. Without lifting his eyes from his glass, Ji-han spoke, his voice so low she almost missed it. "You." "Waitress." Aaliyah froze for a fraction of a second. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She placed the plates on her tray. "Sir?" He still didn't look at her. He gestured vaguely at the tablet displaying shipping manifests and port layouts. 32 containers. Perishable goods.
The port is a dead end.
The rails are a dead end. The roads are a dead end. What do you do? It was a test, but it wasn't for her. It was a barb aimed at his own men, a demonstration of their failure. He was using her, a random piece of the scenery, to humiliate them, to show them that the question was so simple even a waitress could answer it. Choi and Park stiffened, their faces flushing with shame. Aaliyah's mind, however, didn't see the insult. It saw the puzzle. It saw a chessboard with block squares. Her father had been a logistics manager for a small import-export company before he passed. He'd spent her entire childhood complaining about the port of Long Beach over dinner. He'd called it the Great Bottleneck. He taught her how to think around bottlenecks. She didn't hesitate. It wasn't in her nature. Competence was her armor. "You don't move the containers," she said, her voice even. "You move the contents." The silence that followed was different. It was sharp.
Charged.
Kwon Jihan's hand stopped its slow circling of his glass. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head. His obsidian eyes met hers for the first time. There was no warmth in them, only a piercing, analytical intensity. He was taking her apart piece by piece, searching for the trick. "Explain," he commanded. The word was flat. Absolute. "The containers are liabilities," Aaliyah continued, her gaze unwavering. "They're big, they're tracked, they require authorized transport. The contents are just product. Rent a warehouse just outside the port's exclusion zone. Something nondescript. Hire a dozen independent couriers with unmarked refrigerated vans. Day laborers looking for cash, not a union crew that keeps logs. You pay them double the normal rate for a few hours' work. They go in one at a time, through different gates, as simple delivery vehicles. They unload the contents of your containers by hand, box by box, into their vans. It's slow, it's inefficient, but it's invisible. By the time your rivals realize the containers are empty, your product is already dispersed across the city in a dozen untraceable directions." She finished, her heart beating a steady, calm rhythm. She had stated the facts as she saw them. It was the kind of solution her father would have called an elegant pain in the ass. Park and Choi stared at her, their mouths slightly agape. They had been looking at the fortress walls. She had pointed out the sewer grate. Kwon Jihan's face was unreadable. He held her gaze for a long, suffocating moment. The low hum of the restaurant seemed to fade into nothing, leaving only the two of them suspended in the silence. He saw her, not as a waitress, not as a woman, but as a mind that saw the move behind the move. Finally, he blinked. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and dropped several $100 bills onto the table. Then he looked at his men. "Leave," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. Park and Choi scrambled to their feet, gathering the tablet and their briefcases, their eyes darting nervously between Jihan and Aaliyah. They bowed stiffly and were gone, melting back into the world that feared him. Now it was just the two of them at the table. The restaurant and its patrons were a distant, blurry backdrop. "What is your name?" he asked. "Aaliyah." He said her name to himself, a soft whisper. Aaliyah, the way he said it was different. It sounded less like a name and more like a discovery. She began to gather the empty plates, her professional mask sliding back into place. "Will there be anything else, sir?" "Yes," he said, his voice a low command that rooted her to the spot. "You're not going home tonight."
Sit down.
"You and I are going to talk about how you know so much about the port of Long Beach." That was the moment everything changed. The floor of her ordinary world didn't just crack. It fell away into a dark, quiet abyss, and Kwon Jihan was the only thing left to hold on to. He didn't take her out the front door. He led her through the kitchen, a path of silent authority that parted the chaos of chefs and servers. No one met his eyes. They moved through a service exit and into a private elevator that descended not to the lobby, but to a sub-level parking garage. The air grew cold, smelling of concrete and exhaust. The only sound was the click of his polished shoes and the frantic, silent beat of her own heart. The car was a black Maybach, a silent, armored beast waiting in a reserved spot. A driver with a face like a stone carving held the door open. Jihan gestured for her to get in.
It was not a request.
Aaliyah slid onto the buttery leather seat, the door closing behind her with a heavy, final thud. The soundproof interior enveloped them in a profound silence. The city outside became a silent film of streaking lights. "My father," she said, answering the question he hadn't asked again. Her voice was steady, a small victory. He managed logistics. He hated the port. He talked about its vulnerabilities constantly. It was dinner conversation. Jihan didn't respond immediately. He was looking out the window, his reflection a ghostly overlay on the passing cityscape. Vulnerabilities, he repeated, the word tasting strange in his mouth. He taught you to see them. He taught me to solve problems, she corrected softly. He said most people just see the wall. The trick is to see the shape of the hole in the wall. Jihan turned his head, his dark eyes studying her in the dim light of the cabin. The problem you solved tonight, it was created by my cousin. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. It was a piece of information so personal, so dangerous, that giving it to her was an act of something. She wasn't sure what. A threat? A confession? He runs logistics for the Cheon Syndicate now, Jihan continued, his voice devoid of emotion. It was the calm of a deeply banked fire. He built our entire distribution network. And when he left, he took the blueprints with him. He knows every wall, every fortress. He believes he left no holes. That was his wound. Not a woman he'd failed to protect, but a betrayal from his own blood. A brother in all but name who had turned, using the very knowledge Jihan had entrusted to him as a weapon. Her solution hadn't just been clever, it had been a direct counter to a strategy designed by someone who knew his mind intimately. She had found a hole he couldn't see because he was too close to the wall. They arrived at a sleek, glass skyscraper in the heart of Gangnam, a place she'd only seen in magazines. The private elevator opened directly into a penthouse that was more of an observatory, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking, godlike view of Seoul's glittering sprawl. The space was minimalist and severe, all clean lines, chrome, and black leather. It was as beautiful and cold as the man who owned it. He led her to a large glass table where a map of the city's port and industrial districts was already laid out. "Show me," he said. For the next hour, she did. She pointed out warehouses with lax overnight security, talked about the shift changes for independent trucking firms, sketched out dispersal routes on a notepad with a pen he provided. She was operating on pure instinct, a detached, intellectual exercise. She told herself it was survival. If she was useful, he wouldn't discard her. As she worked, she felt his presence behind her, a constant, unnerving pressure at her back. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell that scent of bergamot and smoke. It was distracting, intimate. She focused on the map, on the logistics, on the problem. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, a sharp, angry sound in the quiet room. He answered it, turning away from her to face the window. He spoke in rapid, low Korean. Aaliyah couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. The danger had escalated. When he hung up, he was perfectly still for a long moment, his back to her. "They know the containers are being emptied," he said, his voice a blade of ice.
They don't know how.
"But they sent a message." He turned around. "They found out where you live." The air left Aaliyah's lungs in a silent rush. Her apartment, her life, that small, safe space she had built for herself, violated. The problem was no longer an intellectual exercise on a map. It was real, and it had followed her home. Jihan's eyes were like chips of obsidian. "My driver is downstairs. He can take you to a hotel. You can get on a plane in the morning. Disappear. I will give you enough money to start over anywhere you want." It was an out, a chance to run, to go back to being invisible. Her mind screamed at her to take it, to get out, to forget his face, his voice, the chilling way he'd said her name. But she looked at the map on the table, at the half-formed plan she had created. She thought of his cousin, the traitor who knew his every move. She thought of the cold, calculated look in Jihan's eyes. He wasn't just offering her an escape. He was testing her again. A piece that leaves the board is just a piece. A piece that stays, that chooses to stay, is something else. "No," she said, the word quiet but firm. She met his gaze, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her voice steady. "They'll find me. Your cousin knows how you think. He'll expect you to discard me. The safest place for me right now is the one place he won't expect to find me." She tapped the map. "It's here. With you. Let's finish this." It was a deliberate choice. A step across a line. She was no longer just a waitress dragged into his world. She was a willing participant. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Jihan's eyes.
Surprise?
Respect? He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He walked over to a wet bar and poured 2 glasses of water, his movements precise. He handed one to her. Their fingers brushed. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. It was nothing, and it was everything. She took the glass, her hand trembling slightly. Their eyes locked over the rim. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the weight of her choice, the new and terrifying shape of their alliance. He saw her, and for the first time, she felt she was truly seeing him, not just the Mafia boss, but the man isolated by betrayal, cornered by his own blood. And she had just chosen to stand in that corner with him. The night bled into morning. They didn't talk about her apartment, or the threat, or what would happen next. They worked. Fueled by coffee and a tense, shared energy, they refined the plan. Aaliyah's initial idea was the skeleton. Together, they added muscle and sinew. She brought the outsider's perspective, the unconventional thinking. He brought a terrifyingly precise understanding of his enemy's resources and psychology. They stood side by side at the glass table, the city lights below them winking out as the sun began to stain the horizon. At one point, he reached across her to point at a location on the map, his arm brushing her shoulder. She froze, every nerve ending firing at the point of contact. The fabric of his suit was smooth, the heat from his body undeniable. He didn't pull away immediately. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. He was so close she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the almost invisible beat of a pulse in his throat. He was breathing her air. She told herself it was proximity born of necessity. She was lying. He will anticipate a direct countermove, Jihan said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. He expects me to be the hammer. He won't be looking for the scalpel. His gaze wasn't on the map anymore. It was on her. That's when she knew this was no longer about logistics. The attack came when they were leaving, not at the gleaming tower, which was a fortress, but in the transition. Jihan had decided they needed to move to a more secure location, a safe house on the city's edge. In the sterile, concrete labyrinth of the underground parking garage, the world erupted. It wasn't a loud, flashy firefight. It was quiet and brutally efficient. A black sedan screeched around a pillar, cutting them off. 2 men, faces obscured by shadows, emerged with silenced pistols. Jihan's reaction was instantaneous. He wasn't a man, he was pure reflex. In one fluid motion, he shoved Aaliyah behind him, pushing her down between 2 parked cars, his body a shield over hers. A muffled foot sound hissed past her ear, followed by the sharp crack of a side mirror shattering. Pressed against the cold concrete, the smell of gunpowder and hot metal filling her lungs, Aaliyah felt a strange, terrifying calm descend. Jihan was a whirlwind of controlled violence above her. He moved with an economy of motion that was both beautiful and horrifying. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a choked gasp. When she dared to look up, one man was on the ground, and Jihan was disarming the other, his movements a blur of precise strikes. The second man was bigger, stronger. He fought back, and for a heart-stopping second, he had the upper hand. He slammed Jihan against the side of a car, the impact a dull, metallic boom. The man's gun was free, swinging towards them. There was no time. Jihan was off balance. Aaliyah didn't think. She acted. Her hand closed around a heavy-willed chalk left on the ground. Scrambling forward, she swung it with all her might against the back of the attacker's knee. The joint buckled with a wet, popping sound. The man screamed, a raw, ugly noise that echoed in the enclosed space. The momentary distraction was all Jihan needed. He drove his elbow into the man's throat, and the fight was over. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged sound of their breathing and the distant drip of water. Jihan stood over the 2 downed men, his chest rising and falling. He looked down at her, still crouched on the filthy ground. His eyes were dark, blazing with the aftermath of violence. He reached a hand down to her. She took it. His grip was firm, his palm calloused. He pulled her to her feet easily. They stood there for a beat, surrounded by the carnage, his hand still holding hers. "You didn't run," he said. "It wasn't a question." "There was nowhere to go," she breathed, her gaze dropping to the man groaning on the ground. That's when she saw the security guard, an older man, rounding the corner, drawn by the noise. His eyes widened in panic, his hand fumbling for the radio on his belt. They had seconds. "My wallet," Aaliyah said, her voice sharp and clear. "He tried to take my wallet." She let go of Jihan's hand and stumbled towards the guard, forcing tears to her eyes. "They jumped us. This man," she pointed at Jihan, "he saved me." It was a lie, slick and easy, born of pure adrenaline. She had just crossed another line. She was framing the scene, manipulating the truth, protecting him. The guard, seeing her distress and the expensive cut of Jihan's suit, bought it completely. He fumbled with his radio, calling for backup, his attention entirely on the downed men, now recast as simple muggers. Jihan watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw her do it. He saw her choose a side, choose a lie, and sell it with a conviction that was chillingly effective. He guided her away as the guard was distracted. Back in the car, a different one that appeared out of the shadows, the silence was thick with what had just happened. Her morally gray act. Her survival instinct that had become a tool for his world. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a tremor in her hands. He noticed. He didn't say anything comforting. He didn't offer platitudes. Instead, he looked at her, and the mask of the cold, untouchable boss finally cracked. "You see the angles," he said, his voice raw.
Not just on a map.
"You see them in the moment. In a fight.
With a lie. No one I know does that.
They see the threat and they meet it with force. You change the board." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was an admission of her value, of her uniqueness in his violent, straightforward world. It was a confession of need. "I told myself this was just about getting home," she whispered, the lie she'd been clinging to finally dissolving. "I was wrong." His gaze dropped to her lips. The space between them felt charged, electric. The confession hung in the air, a truth that could not be unsaid. Before either of them could move, his phone buzzed again. He answered. The call was short. When he hung up, all the ice was back in his eyes, colder and harder than before. "That was my cousin," Jihan said, his voice flat. "The attack wasn't for me. It was for you."
"He knows you're with me."
"He said to tell you, he hopes you enjoy your last night in Seoul." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "Except we aren't in Seoul. We're in Los Angeles. He doesn't know where we are, but he knows who you are. And he just made this personal." The final confrontation was set in motion not by Jihan, but by Aaliyah. He had a plan, a fortress, a siege, a war of attrition. It was the hammer. She gave him the scalpel. "He thinks I'm your weakness," she said, looking at him across the sterile living room of the safe house, a minimalist box of concrete and glass overlooking the ocean. "He'll use me as bait. So let's let him." Her plan was audacious. It relied on her intelligence and Jihan's cousin's arrogance. The cousin, Minjun, believed he had outsmarted Jihan at every turn. He would expect Jihan to hide Aaliyah, to lock her away. He would never expect Jihan to use her as the tip of the spear. They fed false information through a known leak in Jihan's organization. A low-level accountant Minjun had turned years ago. The information was simple. Jihan was moving his most valuable asset. Not a person, but a hard drive containing the financial keys to his entire West Coast empire. And the courier was a woman no one would look at twice. The exchange was to happen at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, a public space, neutral ground. Aaliyah walked through the grand entrance of the museum, a simple tote bag over her shoulder. She was wired, a tiny microphone transmitting everything to Jihan and his team, who were stationed nearby. She felt strangely calm. This was her board now. She was no longer a pawn. She was a queen, making her move. She moved through the exhibits, following the predetermined path. She could feel eyes on her. Minjun wouldn't come himself.
He would send his best.
She saw them. Two men trying to look like art patrons, their posture too stiff, their eyes scanning the crowd, not the paintings. The plan was for Jihan's men to intercept them before they could get to her. But Minjun was clever. There was a third man. He came from her blind spot, grabbing her arm in a grip of steel. "Don't make a sound," he hissed, pulling her toward a service corridor. This was the variable, the moment the plan could shatter. Through the microphone, she heard Jihan's voice, a clipped, furious command. But his men were out of position. They were too far. The man shoved her into the dim corridor. "The drive," he demanded. Aaliyah's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was clear. She met the man's eyes. "He's not going to give you what you want," she said, her voice steady. "My boss doesn't negotiate." "Your boss isn't here," the man sneered. "Isn't he?" Aaliyah said, a faint smile on her lips. From the far end of the corridor, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was Kwon Jihan. He had broken his own protocol. He had refused to stay back at the command post. He had come for her himself. He held a pistol, fitted with a suppressor, its dark metal seeming to absorb the light. The man holding her stiffened, his grip tightening. He used her as a shield, pulling her in front of him. "Drop it, Jihan, or she dies." Jihan's face was carved from stone. His eyes were not on the man. They were on Aaliyah. He trusted her. He was waiting for her move. "He told me you were smart," Aaliyah said to the man holding her, her voice a low conversational tone. "He said you were predictable. You'd go for the bait. But he also said you were sloppy." "What are you talking about?" the man growled. "The floor," she said simply. He glanced down for a fraction of a second.
It was all she needed.
She stomped down, her heel grinding into his instep with all her weight. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a heartbeat. In that instant, she dropped, driving her elbow back into his groin. He doubled over, gasping. The corridor filled with two soft coughs from Jihan's pistol. The man collapsed. Silence. Aaliyah stood, breathing heavily, looking at the man on the floor, then at Jihan. He walked towards her, his movements fluid, the gun disappearing back into his jacket. He didn't check on the man he'd shot. He only had eyes for her. He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her face. His fingers were warm against her skin. "It's over," he said. Minjun and his entire crew had been apprehended based on the location data from the third man's phone. The betrayal had been cauterized. The cost was paid. Jihan had been forced to move against his own blood, dismantling a part of his past. Aaliyah had sacrificed her old life, the quiet anonymity she had once cherished. There was no going back to serving tables and being invisible. She had stepped into the light of his world, and it had marked her. Later that night, she stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, the city a tapestry of light spread at her feet. The danger was gone, but a new, more potent tension remained. He came to stand behind her, his presence a familiar weight. She no longer felt the need to arm herself against it. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beside her. "A board that's been reset," she answered without turning. She had not been rescued. She had fought. She had chosen. This was not a cage. It was an empire.
He said her name then.
Aaliyah, it was no longer a discovery or a command. It was an acknowledgement, a claim. He pressed something cold and heavy into her hand. She looked down. It was a chess piece, exquisitely carved from black marble. A queen. "Your move," he said. And Aaliyah knew, with absolute certainty, she was finally home.